Okay, so, a warning. Most of this video was done by the time the news came out that they were making Dune Part 2, and a lot of the commentary within this video pertains to the fact that we did not know if we were going to get a Part 2 or not, but now that we know, a lot of that commentary is kind of dated, so take that with a grain of salt, but otherwise, enjoy the video. I hate going to the movies. I don't want to put the integrity of my evening into the hands of a bunch of sweaty, popcorn-munching teenagers who not only have no respect for their own time, but for the time of others. This was my biggest anxiety when I sat down to watch Dune, the new film from Denis Villeneuve and one of my most anticipated films of the year. And sure enough, my anxieties were deemed worthy. I know I could have watched this movie on HBO Max, and in hindsight, I very well should have, because the audience I was stuck with for my screening of Dune was among the most disrespectful and intolerable I have ever had the displeasure of being with. So me and my dad got to the theater about 20 minutes early, and we decided to go in and find our seats while we waited for the movie to start. But at about 5 minutes till showtime, a group of kids walked in, who were there to sneak into the new Halloween movie. And from the moment they walked in, hollering and screaming like actual children, both me and my dad knew we were in for a world of hurt. The movie started. The kids wouldn't quiet down. The prologue sequence of the film is very quiet and features Zendaya delivering key expository dialogue in a whispery voice. And I shit you not, I literally could not hear what she was saying over these goddamn troglodyte children shouting in the corner of the theater. About 5 minutes in, someone else in the theater told them to shut up, and that quieted them down for a little bit, but not 10 minutes later, they were back on their bullshit. When they left the theater to sneak into their movie, I have never felt a greater sense of relief in my entire life. Throughout the rest of the movie, people were texting, people forgot to turn their ringers off and received phone calls and text messages at full volume, and the couple right next to us were chatting and eating popcorn as loud as they possibly could. The conditions under which I saw this movie literally could not have been worse. I spent the first half of this movie just angry at my surroundings rather than actually absorbing myself in the movie. And that really sucks, because this movie was awesome, and I had a great time during the moments in which I could actually pay attention to it. But it seems as though I was one of the only people that went to see this movie to see a movie. The medium of film has been whittled down to a means of killing time. I could have seen Halloween Kills with a crowded, disrespectful theater and not given a shit, but I opted to watch that movie at home because there was nothing stopping me. I didn't care about that movie, but even if I did go to see it in a theater, I always know that there's someone there who does. See, I have this thing, not many people have heard of it, it's called respect, and even my Dumbo 8 brain can acknowledge the fact that even if I do not care about an experience, I want to preserve that experience for someone who does. So when I go into a movie that I've been anticipating for well over a year and I'm not met with that same level of respect, it's not just annoying, it's flat out insulting. If you're the type of person that talks during movies or just not aware of your surroundings in general, stop going to the theater. You don't deserve it. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, Dune is a 2021 science fiction film directed by Denis Villeneuve, based off of the 1965 novel by Frank Herbert of the same name. This was easily my most anticipated film of the year. I honestly don't know if there's ever been a movie that has gone through more bullshit than this one that has actually contributed to the hype. I mean, first it got delayed, then the director trashed the Warner Bros. HBO Max deal and got a bunch of hate. Then the director trashed Marvel movies and got even more hate. And now it's finally out for the world to see. And what do I think of it? Yeah, I mean, it was pretty good. I wasn't quite blown away by this movie like I expected to be, but there is so much going on here that is damn near perfect that I can't help but just love every inch of it. There are a few problems, of course, and we'll get into those, but my bottom line thoughts are this. Dune is a masterpiece of deceptive marketing and a thrilling exhibit of scope and budget in the hands of a visionary director who, in a somewhat unexpected turn of events, seems to have been given a lot of control over his vision. The question everyone is going to be asking in the coming weeks is, well, is it better than the 1984 Dune? And the answer is, yeah, obviously. That's not a very high standard to meet. David Lynch's Dune is a disaster of a movie boiled down to the most basic definition of the word narrative, fueled by pretty set design and cheesy presentation. This movie was going to be better than the original no matter what it did. And to say that it delivered on that expectation isn't really saying anything about the movie at all. But the real question here is this: how does it hold up to the source material? Well, pretty well, actually. I tried my hardest to get through the entire book before the movie came out, but I just couldn't do it, seeing as how the book is incredibly dense and often tough to read for a guy like me who can't pronounce words with more than 3 syllables. I did, however, read almost exactly up until the point that this first film covers. And for those of you who are uneducated on what this movie is before going into it like I was, I'm sorry to break that news to you. This is not Dune, but Dune Part 1. Look at any of the promotional material. Trailers, posters, TV spots, they all say Dune. Just Dune. No subtitle. So you can imagine my surprise when the title card appeared on screen reading Dune Part 1. I'll be honest, it left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. This isn't the fault of the filmmakers at all, oh no, but rather a fault of the marketing, which is a whole other can of worms that I can't help but explain. The thing with Dune Part 1 is that I don't know how to even begin talking about it. This isn't your typical 2-part movie where the first half could be taken in isolation and feel like a complete story, just with room for expansion. No, this movie literally feels like the first half of a much longer movie split right down the middle in a way that isn't all that satisfying. I wasn't left eager to see what happens next, I was left with a feeling of, wait, is that the fucking end of the movie? Don't get me wrong, I will be seeing part 2 if and when it happens, but waiting up to 3 years for what is effectively the second half of one movie isn't exactly the best way to keep me going. I can watch It Chapter 1 in isolation because the story was left off on an ambiguous but satisfying note. This movie left off on an unsatisfying note, as though there were 3 hours worth of movie left, likely because there is. Is this partly the movie's fault? Yes, but the fact of the matter is that this movie led me to believe that I was about to consume a full story. If this movie were released with the Part 1 subtitle, I honestly think that my reaction to the ending would have been dampened a bit, because at least then I would be expecting to get hit with an intermission rather than a conclusion. This video is going to be much more forensic than my other reviews, and as a result I expect it to be much longer. I'm not going to beat around the bush with spoilers here. If you haven't seen the movie, click off the video now and come back once you have, because there is absolutely no way for me to effectively talk about this movie without speaking as though you have already seen it. So pay heed now to my incredibly long-winded and very messy thoughts on Dune, and my expectations for what's to come next. So before we get started, I actually have a little fun fact for you. In order to play the role of Paul Atreides in the movie Dune, actor Timothée Chalamet stayed up all night playing with they worm. And let me tell you, you can tell he put in the work, like... So, to start off, I'm gonna get all the bona fide pros of this film out of the way. In terms of scope, this film is a masterpiece. I genuinely don't know if I've ever seen a movie this huge before, and as someone with a phobia of large buildings, I spent a majority of this film not being able to breathe properly. Right off the bat, this movie does an incredible job of establishing scale. It recognizes that this is an epic story, and both in the visuals and in the story, it does an incredible job of matching that scale. The buildings are huge, sure, but there's also incredible pathos within the narrative. The spectacle not only matches the grand rivalry of the houses that the story is based upon, but accents it in a mesmerizing way. I don't think anyone has a more adept sense of scale than Denis Villeneuve, and after Blade Runner 2049, I knew that no matter what he did, Villeneuve's style matches the story to a T. The cinematography is muted and gray, and in terms of style bears very close resemblance to Blade Runner 2049, and it does a great job of further immersing you into this alien world. Everything looks familiar but somehow foreign, which I think ties both into the themes of the movie and the goal it's trying to achieve incredibly well. On top of that, the score by Hans Zimmer is simply breathtaking. It managed to make bagpipes sound badass, which is a sentence I don't think has ever been said before this movie. The main theme is simple but memorable, and the sweeping, swashbuckling motifs that reoccur during scenes of extreme spectacle only add to the unimaginable scale of this thing. From a technical standpoint, this movie's a masterpiece. There's no doubt about it. This is the type of soundtrack to listen to while you're working out or something. It just gets you pumped to an unprecedented degree. It transcends the stock action orchestral score that is often exhausted by these types of blockbusters, and instead transforms the material to a point where it literally could not be any different without drastically drastically changing the entire thing. This entire movie feels so thorough, so singular in its approach that it only could have been made by this exact group of insanely talented people, which is shocking to see in a world where most blockbusters feel as though they were spit out by an algorithm. Villeneuve cares so passionately about cinema as an art form, and he is dedicated to keeping the form alive by consistently creating great works of art, which is honestly pretty commendable. I know this guy has had some bad luck with the box office in the past, but this film already seems to be making its money back, and I hope he can continue to get his projects made for years to come. Please save us, Denny. I can't stomach another 20 fucking Marvel movies. I just can't. This movie's hype and success only serves as an indicator to major studios that creative control is a good thing, that people like Villeneuve are making movies today out of a love for making movies, not as a means of milking profits out of a multiplex. But if you can do both, then that's an incredible thing. It's films like Dune that make me remember why I love movies to begin with, especially after being incredibly let down by a movie that came out just a week before this one. However, fellatio aside, this movie is not perfect. While the pacing is consistently quick and the film very engaging for much of the first 2/3, I found this movie beginning to drag a little bit in the third act. It doesn't even remotely feel its length, but I found myself feeling the urge to check my watch at certain points after the raid on Arrakeen. It's a low point in the story, and as a basis for the third act of the first half of this 5-hour movie, it didn't flow as well as the rest of the film did. The final scene with the Fremen probably could have been cut down a little bit, as well as some of the scenes with Paul and Jessica traveling across the desert, but otherwise this movie was impeccably paced, and I think there's a reason for that. Have any of you seen Scenes from a Marriage? Well, I've seen the theatrical cut, which clocks in at nearly 3 hours in length, as opposed to the television version's 5 hours, and that theatrical cut goes by so quick despite it being so incredibly long, and the reason for that is you are actively watching a 3-hour movie with the pacing of a 5-hour movie. It's structured to fit that insane length, and so watching a condensed version of that is bound to go by quicker than a 3-hour movie that was actually meant to be 3 hours. It's the same thing with Dune. This is the first half of a 5 or 6 hour movie, and as a result, the pace is incredibly fluid and almost never loses its brevity. This isn't 3 acts, it's 1.5. I don't know if what I'm saying here really makes any sense, but that's about the closest thing I can draw resemblance to. Like, okay, Dune is only about 10 minutes shorter than Blade Runner 2049, but Blade Runner feels infinitely longer because it's a complete story packing in 3 hours worth of content into it. Dune is only 2.5 hours of a much longer story, and as a result, doesn't quite feel as dense or as slow as its contemporaries. This isn't a detriment to the film, not at all, because it managed to make the ridiculously long runtime feel not only warranted, but necessary. This is a dense story, and it takes a lot of time to catch the viewer up to speed and immerse them into the world. I'm honestly really looking forward to part 2, if that ever happens, because now that all of the context is in place, I think it now has the opportunity to bring Frank Herbert's vision into full swing. In terms of exposition, this film has a lot of it, but it never feels overbearing or like it's over-cramming like the original film, because the extended runtime gives the narrative room to breathe and fill viewers in on the literally dozens of wacky sci-fi ideas, and not just by explaining them, but by showing them in action. For example, the Gom Jabbar. It's a poison needle, and the Reverend Mother is threatening Paul with it. How do you get that information across effectively? Hey, this is a poison needle, and I'm threatening you with it. It never tries to overcomplicate things or shove everything onto you at once. It drip feeds the knowledge of this world to you, bit by bit, which not only allows the viewer to slowly assimilate into this fantasy world, but it also retains that alien mystery that made the original novel so alluring. The screenplay written by Villeneuve, Eric Roth, and Josh Spates is a fairly straight adaptation of the novel, and manages to keep the sprawling space opera intact within this ultra-realistic rendition of the setting. The script isn't perfect, there are a few things that they get wrong that I'll be getting to further on in this video, but from a strict adaptation standpoint, it manages to keep just about everything in balance without ever feeling on the nose in its presentation or losing momentum except maybe for the third act. If I'm being honest, the biggest problem I had with this movie is where they chose to end it. I know it's funny to hear me say that my only problem with this movie is that I wish it were longer, but after a downright astounding action sequence and a relatively slow third act, the movie kind of just ends? I don't know. I feel as though if they pushed it a little further, they could have not only set up the sequel a little better, but tied up enough of the loose ends to make the first film feel complete as a whole, which, as of now, it certainly doesn't. The conclusion of the Baron's character in this movie is a one-off scene of little import, and while that goo bath does look fittingly nasty, I feel like they could have included at least one more scene at least establishing his plans for the next installment. This ending really worries me because when I look at it through the eyes of a moviegoer who had no intention of seeing a two-part story, I don't know if it leaves off on an interesting enough note to fully warrant their willingness to go and see part 2. Of course, I'm gonna see it because I'm a fucking nerd, but I could hardly call this ending a cliffhanger so much as a sudden stop. It cuts to black right as it seems the story is beginning to gain momentum again, and as a result, it rendered the whole of the film as kinda Part 2 is bound to have a thrilling conclusion, but if you're marketing this as one movie and then springing it onto audiences that it's actually two, it feels less like a cliffhanger and more of a betrayal. Though that could be my overanalysis of what is ultimately an ambiguous ending, I can't help but feel a little let down by how this movie wrapped up, and it's especially upsetting considering that we don't even really know if there will be a part 2 or not. This movie's bound to make a shit ton of money, but that anxiety still remains. Would that not be one of the greatest betrayals in the history of cinema? And if it were, why is Dune such a cursed name in the film industry? What did Frank Herbert ever do to you? But why does this ending feel like such a betrayal, I hear you ask? Well, it all comes down to the straw that broke the camel of the film industry's back, and that's the marketing. There isn't a lot to say about this aspect of the movie, but it's something worth mentioning. Denis Villeneuve has been consistently fucked over by the way his films have been marketed for 2 consecutive films now. It all started back in 2017 with the marketing for Blade Runner 2049, when quite possibly one of the best sequences in the entire film was spoiled in just about every piece of promotional material. I am talking, of course, about Harrison Ford reprising his role as Deckard. It is so obvious when you watch the movie that the scene was meant to have a surprise outcome. Officer K would not have walked around that building for as long as he did if they weren't trying to build up to a big surprise. Only that surprise was completely destroyed because they decided, hey, let's just put Harrison Ford in all the trailers and on all the posters, because God forbid we let viewers experience the film the way the director intended people to experience, we have to make more money. And then the movie fucking flopped anyway. Why would you ruin that? And now he's getting boned with Dune. I can only imagine that this misleading marketing will impact the box office returns of the second film because you made the movie look like something it isn't. The whole movie. When I saw this shot in the trailer, I figured that would be the climactic sequence at the end, but nope. The shot in the trailer goes on for about the same length as that scene because it's a dream sequence foreshadowing part 2. To add on to that, the trailers would lead you to believe that Zendaya is like a main character in the movie, but literally every scene she's in is in the trailer. She has 7 minutes of screen time in the entire movie. Why would you? I understand the approach that they're trying to take here. There's obvious logistical reasons that they would not market the film as a part 1 because that's bound to impact the short-term profits negatively. People aren't willing to buy a ticket to a 2-part story that they know they won't get the second half of for an undetermined amount of time. You want to know why that negatively impacts the box office? Because people like it when movies fucking end. I've never seen an approach to marketing a film be so smart yet so brain dead at the same time. But this is really kind of indicative of how Dune is an impossible story to adapt. There's no way to comfortably apply it to the medium of film because of its structure. Without wildly changing pretty much everything about the story, there's no way to reasonably fit this movie into a single volume. Look how it turned out the first time. So then what do we do? Well, I'll stand by it to this day. I think the most effective way to adapt this story would be in the form of a miniseries. I know they already did a miniseries, but I haven't seen it yet and can't speak on it. But if you took Villeneuve's adaptation and stretched it into a 10-episode miniseries, then it would probably be the best thing he's ever made. And for all I know, part 2 of this movie could blow me away and leave me thinking the exact same thing. But with the content that is currently presented to me, I am unfulfilled and underwhelmed. The marketing sabotaged the movie, but pretty much every single person that has seen the movie is coming away with the exact same thoughts. What the fuck was that ending? It's unreasonable to just blame the marketing team because even with the part 1 subtitle, the ending would still be pretty jarring. But if the film were marketed accurately, it would have at least softened that fucking blow. I know I'm getting unnecessarily angry about this, but like, What the fuck? Now, I mentioned before that this story would work way better as a miniseries, and while I still stand by this point, I think in terms of adaptation, Dune Part 1 does a lot of stuff right, but when you're adapting a story this massive, cuts are sure to be made. Now, some of them are for the better, and others, well... Considering I've only seen one other adaptation of this material, I'm gonna frame this section through a comparison of the two. When compared to the 1984 original, Dune Part 1 improves drastically on most every issue. The characters actually feel as though they're real people, not cardboard cutouts programmed to spit out exposition. The world building isn't rushed and stilted, making the whole thing feel like a bloated Wikipedia entry. It instead feels like a story with a plot, not a basic summary of events all loosely strung together into something that resembles a distant cousin of a narrative. I mean, I would have thought it was unheard of before this, but apparently it turns out movies can actually be interesting to watch. The characters in this film actually feel as though they have some relation or common interests with each other. They're not just pawns set next to each other spewing exposition like in Lynch's film. You feel a genuine sense of camaraderie between Paul and Duncan, genuine respect and loyalty from Gurney and Leto, genuine near disdain to the Reverend Mother from Jessica. They all feel like characters who existed before the movie began, rather than NPCs that pop into existence the second the cameras start rolling. The original novel is incredibly Shakespearean, and in terms of capturing that vaudevillian theatrical flair, I actually think the original does that a lot better. It is a space opera, after all. In fact, I would be willing to say that it was a pioneer in the modernization of that form. Without Dune, I don't think we'd have properties like Star Wars, which is funny considering the 1984 movie was attempting to capitalize off the success of Star Wars and then failed to. It's a weird sort of feedback loop. You see that a lot with like James Bond and Christopher Nolan. You know, like Nolan was inspired by James Bond to make Inception, and then Inception was a success, so now the newer Bond movies are deriving from Nolan's style, and it's weird because one thing inspired another, and then that one inspired another. I don't know, I'm getting ahead of myself. The story now actually has time to breathe and devotes more time to world building in the first half, which is something Lynch's version severely under-delivered on. There are several reasons that the original film failed to do a good job of adapting the source material that have all been talked about to death since the 1980s, and one of the chief problems is studio constraints. This is all just a roundabout way of saying that Dune is near impossible to bring to the screen. What might have been the closest adaptation of the source material would have been the version envisioned by Jodorowsky, a film that would have run from 10 to 14 hours long, which is, of course, impossible to produce and doubly impossible to distribute. Or at least, it was. In the 1970s, there was a firm distinction between the realm of film and the realm of television, and it all came down to money. TV shows were considerably cheaper than movies, and as a result, nothing on TV could ever match up to what was in the movies in terms of scope and budget. But nowadays, that distinction is a little blurry, partly thanks to the rise of streaming services, and also partly due to the fact that both film and television are slowly being dominated by the same handful of conglomerates. Television now rivals that of film in a way that it never has before. I mean, Loki is essentially just a 5-hour Marvel movie, and while I think Marvel movies shouldn't be anything but shorter, the fact that that's now a possibility is revolutionary. Now, unfortunately, this is technically beneficial to the conglomerates as well, but from a narrative perspective, the concept of length becomes less of a focal point, which is by far a good thing. TV episodes can be 90 minutes long, hell, 2 hours, and it can air without commercials, and it can air uncensored, and it can stream the same night it premieres. There's so much more room to experiment creatively, no longer needing to conform to runtime or studio constraints. Dune could be perfectly applied to this format, alongside a creative team as strong as that in Villeneuve's new film, and it would be the cock of the block for years. Virgins like me love the idea of things that are really long and kind of boring, but big and loud, and aliens, and lasers, and hot boys, and the new Dune is all those things, so in that way it succeeds. But if it were 15 hours long, well, it'd be even better. Even despite these constraints though, Dune Part 1 manages to stick pretty close to the book in all the best ways. But if there's one thing this adaptation suffers from, it's a few of the characters getting the short end of the stick. The biggest example of this would be Dr. Yui, the traitor to House Atreides, gets severely underdeveloped in this new adaptation. If there's one thing the original film got right, it's this scene, a moment in which Yui confides in Jessica, and in this scene alone we immediately understand Yui's motivations as a character, and his morals with his actions. In the new film, I don't know if they just didn't have time for this or if they were trying to turn this into some kind of plot twist, but Yui gets almost no development until his betrayal, his motivations being explained in a very clunky way immediately afterward. I guess it's an okay reveal, but it doesn't feel earned as a result of none of this being established earlier on. It's frustrating when the inclusion of just one scene would massively improve on what is honestly one of the only flaws in this movie. I also think Kynes got the shaft in a much more minor degree, but her character's arc is still there, albeit just not as well-rounded as it was in the novel. It's still leagues better than what the character got in the original film though, so I can't complain. But in terms of the positives this film does for the characters, I think the adaptation of Paul is incredibly faithful, and I think it's one that some people wrongfully criticize. I've seen people online saying Timothy gives a lifeless performance, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but the character of Paul is incredibly apathetic to just about everyone but himself and Duncan, Idaho. He's incredibly self-centered, and he's not one to openly show emotion very easily. The biggest thing this movie gets wrong, however, as well as the 1984 original, and as far as I can tell any adaptation of this story, is it fails to see the actual narrative within Dune. It's not a story about prophecies and gods, but about propaganda and political meddling. The Emperor is funding a nationalist house to sabotage the caretakers of an indigenous people, and the Bene Gesserit are meddling behind the scenes, planting the seeds that this punk-ass kid is the chosen one, and through their manipulation they micromanage each political movement, bringing Paul up the ladder until he overthrows the Emperor. It's all one big story of political espionage, and the commentary it provides under that lens is incredibly interesting. The two film adaptations have so far seemed to focus more on the magic prophecies aspect of it, but think about it. The Bene Gesserit place this mentally unstable kid on a planet where a psychedelic drug is literally in the air that he breathes. He's tripping balls and slowly destroying his brain on acid until his delusions of grandeur are so strong that the Bene Gesserit are finally ready to make him a piece of the puzzle. This is an incredibly cynical and unimaginative way of approaching the source material, but it's the first thing I thought of when I began to think about the different schemes that all play out throughout the book. There's always constant mention of plans within plans and paths being set. It's hard not to think of treason. I think if the story were to be adapted in this objectivist of a perspective, it would be pretty fucking boring, but the point still stands. There's enough commentary within the book no matter what way you look at it. Subtext is always up to interpretation, and as much as I'd love to see the perspective be switched up a bit, I think the route they took with this new film was very well done and incredibly engaging. Although they did mispronounce the word Harkonnen, like a lot actually, so no brownie points there.
The Harkonnens.
It's times like this I wish I could just have the perfect Dune movie. A choose-your-own-adventure type of thing. Like, let's see, I want the 14-hour runtime, and I want Villeneuve to direct it, but I want it to have come out in the 1980s, and I want a short shout-out Mapes, just because, I don't know, I'm a freak like that. So, what's gonna happen now? I honestly don't know how to gauge what I want out of the second installment, as I haven't finished the book and I think I've blocked the last half of the 1984 movie out of my memory due to trauma. If they replicated everything they did here, I think it'd be a pretty great capstone. I just hope after the story has run its course that they call it quits. I don't want Dune to become another franchise. I don't give a shit what happens in the next 5 Dune books. I want them to be done after this. If Denis is happy, then I'm happy, and if I have to sit through the next volume with an audience of disgusting loudmouth children, then so be it. I'll be first in line. All I want is for a movie to finally, for once, just fucking end. I've seen part 1 twice now, and I'll probably be revisiting it a few more times before part 2 comes out in the future. This was an incredible movie, and every issue I have with it is one that very well may be resolved later on. We're experiencing a story that is being actively shaped. It's not yet concluded. The only reason I've been talking for so long is because I just don't know how to break this down as a complete work in any sort of succinct way. When part 2 is released, I'll probably revisit this movie in a video that's twice as long. It'll be interesting to see how they put the second half of the book to the screen. Knowing how gutted Lynch's version got, even seeing part 1 receive as much depth as it did was almost gratifying in a way. I think that as long as the sequel receives a runtime to match or even top this one, they'll finally get the chance to bring the story to life in a complete and satisfying way. If there's one thing I love, it's way too long fantasy movies, so this is basically my dream come true. I think the second film now has a chance to improve on basically everything I didn't like about this movie, because now there's no more material left to mislead people with. There's now a cast of well-developed and interesting characters ready to carry out the second half of this story, and they have the same guy who is clearly so passionate about this book at the helm. So, as a message to Warner Bros. And Legendary and whoever else, do not fuck this up. You have no idea how lucky you got to make something like this actually work. Listen to the people like me who clearly know more than you and clearly know how to run a business better than you, someone who barely has a high school education and a platform large yet small enough to make it feel like my opinions matter. You wouldn't want to piss me off, now would you? As far as closing thoughts go, I don't have a whole lot. I think this video has gone on long enough already, so I'll try to keep it brief. Dune didn't change my life. It didn't have me bolting for the fire exits, but when put in comparison with most other major movies I saw this year, Dune is by far one of the best. I still like Blade Runner 2049 more, and in fact, of the 3 of his films I've seen, I probably like this one the least, but that doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it's a far cry from it. This movie was great. This movie was awesome. This movie was epic. It's a big, loud, entertaining time at the movies, but it's the genius of Denis Villeneuve that is heightening the material into something that it's never been before. Cool. Dune is not cool. It never has been. But now, with Villeneuve's new movie, it seems to actually be striking a chord with people who aren't complete fucking nerds. Dare I say it? It seems to be appealing to normal people, not dripping with gamer sweat dorm room armchair critics with 10 years of unbroken subscription to WoW and a nicotine dependency. Which really should piss me off, because it was always nice to have something that appealed strictly to my demographic. But I couldn't be happier about this movie's success. And with that being said, that's all I have to say about Dune. Thank you for watching. This video turned out to be a lot longer than I thought it would be. I thought this was going to be like 10 minutes, me just sitting in front of a backdrop, whining about this movie for 10 or so minutes, but now it's turned into something that's looking to be well over 30, so there you go. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe, check out all my links in the description, and to Content ID, check out that cool little copyright disclaimer down there. It's pretty neat. It's full of pretty useful information. You could use it. I'll be real, you could use it. So yeah, thank you for watching. I'm gonna go take a nap and then start working on a video that's even longer than this one. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next video.